Welcome to Understanding the Context and Impact of Immigration Policy and COVID-19 webinar, presented by the American Psychology Association. Thank you for joining us. APA is delighted to bring you this special webinar, which is designed to provide an overview of the intersectional stressors facing DACA recipients, including changes in immigration policy as well as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's begin with a few housekeeping notes. At this time, all lines are muted. If you require technical support, please submit questions within the Tech Support tab on the right side of your screen, not to be confused with the Q&A tab. You should be able to see the slides live. If you experience technical issues, please try 1. Refreshing your browser window, 2. Trying a different browser. If you are behind a corporate security wall that has not approved this website for access, please contact your technical support team. To view the slides in full screen mode, click the screen icon next to Live on the lower right-hand side of the slide and press Escape to exit full screen. To access the PDF file of today's slides, scroll to the bottom of your screen and click on a link under the Handouts section. We encourage you to submit questions about today's topic throughout the webinar in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. Questions will be answered during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer all questions. If you'd like to rewatch this session, a recording will be available within 5 to 7 business days of the original air date. You will be able to access it from your course dashboard. To obtain the 1.5 APA continuing education credits offered for this webinar, you must click OK when you see the attendance verification box appear on your screen during this webinar. All you need to do is click OK. Remember to respond to all attendance verifications you see. You must also complete a webinar evaluation, so stay online through the conclusion of the webinar. And you will see a pop-up appear on your screen with access to the evaluation. A CE certificate will be emailed to you and will also be available for download in your course dashboard. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email cpe@apa.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Germán Cadenas. He is an assistant professor of counseling psychology at Lehigh University. His research focuses on the psychology of undocumented immigrants and underrepresented minorities, particularly their critical consciousness and its links to higher education outcomes, work and career development, and psychological well-being. He leads an immigration collaborative across 9 divisions of the American Psychological Association and the National Latinx Psychological Association, which brings together undocumented communities and psychologists nationwide. He identifies as an immigrant and is formerly undocumented. Now I'd like to turn our presentation over to him. Ron, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And welcome everybody. Welcome everybody who is tuning in today. We are very glad to have you here with us for this webinar on building cultural competence in stressful times for immigrants during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the DACA decision, and many other stressors that our immigrants communities are facing. We're glad to be doing this webinar for the first time ever. It's historic for APA to offer these kinds of CE offerings, and we're just really excited to be here. I'm joined today by Dr. Alfonso Mercado, newly minted Doctora Laura Minero, and also Norma, and we'll do introductions in a second. And I do want to say that something that is pretty unique about this webinar is that it centers the stories and the experiences of DACA recipients themselves. So 2 of our presenters today are DACA recipients, and so you will be hearing a very unique perspective on the psychology of immigration. Before we start, I do want to take a moment to thank our secondary sponsors: APA Division 17, Society of Counseling Psychology, the National Latinx Psychological Association, Lehigh College of Education, Immigrants Rising, Forward US, the Informed Immigrant Platform, and United We Dream. And we are very glad to be doing this in collaboration with immigrant rights organizations and organizations that are serving the immigrant community on the ground every day. So this is part of a three-part webinar series. This is the very first one, which focuses mostly on the context of immigration policy and COVID, so that we as providers can get a sense for the contextual, the systemic, sociopolitical, socioeconomic stressors facing the immigrant community. And the other two webinars will go more in depth into psychotherapy strategies for fostering resilience, as well as how to strengthen communities of support to serve immigrant clients. And I want to point out the guide to providing mental health services to immigrants impacted by changes to DACA and COVID-19, which we were glad to publish in April, and it's available for free online. And it was a sort of a starting point to creating this webinar. So let's go ahead and do some introductions. How about we go around and share a little bit about what brings us to this work, what brings us to working with immigrant communities, both on the professional side, but also on the personal. What is the personal connection to this? So I'll hand it off to whoever would like to share their connection to immigration.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Minero, and as Dr. Cadenas just mentioned, I just graduated from University of Wisconsin-Madison with my counseling psychology degree, and I have DACA currently. So that is kind of what brings me to this work. I'm originally from Guadalajara, Jalisco, and I came here at the age of 5 with my parents. And I'm really happy that this work is being done because it's so critical. And I know throughout my own journey, there's been a lot of people that have supported me on my path to be able to get here. And yet there were a lot of barriers. So getting to this point has not been easy. And I hope that through the support that people provide, even psychologically and for mental well-being, that support is so, so, so important. So I'm really thankful for everyone who's on this call and wanting to learn.
Yes. Hello, my name is Norma Ramirez. I am also pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology, and currently I am a PhD candidate, and I'm also a plaintiff in the DACA case that we won last Thursday. And so this is an issue that obviously it greatly impacts me, and an issue that um, that is very important to our communities as we recognize the lack of mental health access and also competency.
All right. Thank you, Laura and Norma and Germán for being here today and having me present with you guys. And thank you, Germán, for thanking our sponsors and APA and NLPA for having us present this timely series for mental health providers and psychologists. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in South Texas on the Texas-Mexico border. And I do research and clinical work with various immigrant groups and asylum seekers here. And I am excited to share the type of work that my research lab is doing and the different professional associations advocating, right, for this population. So thank you.
I apologize. Thank you, Alfonso, and thank you, Norma and Laura, for sharing a little bit about your background and what connects you to this work and this population. For me, I'll share a little bit about my own background. I identify myself as an immigrant also. I'm an immigrant from Venezuela, and I was undocumented for 9 years. And during that time, I became quite involved in immigrant rights and community organizing related to the immigrant rights movement. And that eventually brought me to mental health. And I received a PhD from Arizona State University. I did my doctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, where I focused most of my time there on working with undocumented students on campus. And that's one of the campuses with the largest undocumented student population. And so a lot of what I've shared today comes from my own personal experience, but also from the clinical experience, having worked providing psychotherapy to undocumented students during a really stressful time, during the time when DACA was rescinded, and right after the 2016 election, which was a highly, highly stressful moment for our communities. Okay. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura and Norma, who will give us a background on immigration policy and DACA and what we as providers need to know about these contextual policy stressors in order to be able to work with the undocumented community. So Laura and Norma, please take it away.
So to begin, we are starting, talking about policy and the impact that it has on undocumented individuals with and without DACA and their families. To begin, we want to center it acknowledging that, when immigration started, there were really no restrictions. And anyone could come, and it was mostly people from European countries who were coming to the U.S. And but at the same time, the way that the U.S. then began to treat immigrants of color was to devalue them, but at the same time to use them to build this new country with successful economic, political, and social institutions. Um, so right here we have a very broad overview of some immigration policies that have happened. So we can see in the beginning, there was the majority of people were coming from Germany, Great Britain, and Ireland. And it wasn't until 1882 that the first immigration policy happened to exclude someone based on where they were coming from, right? So the Chinese Exclusion Act. And after that, we have the Immigration Act of 1882, which taxed each new migrant 50 cents and barred convicts and other undesirable individuals from applying, and created the first requirements for national origin, and declined admission to those who were 16 or older and illiterate. So we could start to see how immigration policy is starting to become exclusionary and only to focus and benefit certain kinds of people. And so they continue on. And another one that I want to highlight is in 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. This one, if undocumented immigrants enter the U.S. for more than 6 months, they were to receive either a 3 or 10-year ban to not be able to re-enter the U.S. So for example, let's say I came here and I was here for more than 6 months. I would then, if I left the country, I could then not return for either 3 or 10 years, depending on whatever, how that was determined. And this is important because this is actually what has brought on this new wave of immigration that we have. Before, we had mostly, males and fathers coming to the U.S. to work and then going back to Mexico primarily. But when this happened, this made it so that then these same, fathers and males to not return back to Mexico. So then they stayed here. And then after that, families, followed to come to the US to move because this created family separation. And so we can see how these immigration policies have taken shape in their exclusion and have promoted the migration that we're seeing. And more relevant to our conversation, in 2001, the Development Relief and Education for Alien Minors Act was introduced, but it did not pass, and there have been several reiterations of a similar bills that have not passed. The most recent one is the HR 6 bill that has passed the House, but it has not been heard by the Senate. And so, again, we see this fight for immigration policy and how it is exclusionary at the same time. Laura? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Norma, for sharing that. We thought it was really important to provide the background of kind of the broad context. And I do want to say, right, that even before people started immigrating to this country, right, this land belonged to our native siblings. And I want to honor that and say that. And also, a part of the US did belong to Mexico. And so I think that often gets missed in these conversations. And another thing that's important to mention is that some of the conditions that exist in other countries might even be caused because of the United States. And so there's a lot of reasons why people end up deciding to migrate, right? So they might be escaping violence or just looking for a better opportunity. Maybe there's poverty, right? Or people are unable to really acquire the basic physiological and safety needs that an individual needs to be able to survive and thrive. And so I just want to name that off the bat. Right here, I think it's so important to highlight that there is pre-Trump relevant immigration legislation for us to discuss. And Norma already shares some of those, but I think oftentimes people think that before Trump, everything was fine. And I think it's really important to highlight that that's not true. Just like Norma has already echoed, a lot of immigration policy is racist, is based on white supremacy, and is highly exclusionary. And I think we really need to delve into that and examine why that is, right? There are some policies like the Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965 that forbade undocumented students from receiving federal aid for post-secondary education. So this means that undocumented students, even though they may have gotten a K through 12 public education, they do not have access to any federal financial aid like other students. So you can already see that there's this pipeline created, right? That yes, because of the Plyer versus Doe 1982 Act, you could receive free K through 12 education, but the college pipeline, right? The pipeline to college actually becomes a lot slimmer because how are you going to pay for college? That's necessary, right? I do want to say though that there are some independently enacted state laws. So I know we have people from all over the United States on this call. So if you are going to be serving undocumented immigrants and immigrants in general, it's really important to research, right, and examine what are some of the laws that exist in my state that are going to implicate the experiences of the individuals that I work with. Some of these are relevant to students, right? So in-state tuition. There are some states that allow students who went to high school in that state and met certain requirements, they can pay in-state tuition. But there are other students in other states that don't have access to that. So even if they went to high school, got a high school degree, and now they're trying to go to college, they have to pay out-of-state tuition fees, which again contributes to that limited pipeline to college, right? So again, we're seeing that these policies can be very exclusionary. Um, there's driver's licenses in certain states. So I know that in California, you can get a driver's license if you are undocumented, but again, that doesn't exist in every state. And think about how critical this resource is, right? People need to drive to work. People need to drive their children to school. If people have health appointments or if they're caregivers and they need to take someone else to work, they need a driver's license, right? So that they can drive to work safely. So this implicates people's lives day in and day out, depending on what they have access to. There's also a lot of limited access to emergency services and even just health insurance in general. Many states do not allow undocumented individuals, regardless of whether they're students or not, to get access to health insurance. And so that's critical, right? That's going to shape an individual's experience a lot. And then we have DACA, and I'm going to hand it off to Norma to talk about that.
Yeah, so then DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it was offered in June 15 of 2012 with President Obama. And we want to emphasize that this this executive action came from the ground roots organization of undocumented individuals who protested, who went and sat in their offices. This wasn't something that President Obama woke up one day and said he was going to do. This came from the pressure from the undocumented community. And so what DACA means is that if you were under the age of 31 and older than, I believe, 15 years old as of June 15, 2012, you could apply for this protection from deportation, a work permit, and depending on state laws, this could open up other possibilities, right? Like getting a driver's license and so forth. So you could read basically some of the eligibility requirements, but something that we want to emphasize, or that I would like to emphasize, is that even as a relief, DACA still created this exclusion, right? So what we have here is the idea of the best of the best. You had to have gone to either be in school or have graduated, right? And you definitely could not have any kind of criminal record, whether that's a felony or a significant misdemeanor or like a DUI. All under the umbrella of public safety. But these, we know, don't make a person be worthy. These, everyone can have, how can I say this? This makes it so that in order for you to receive a benefit, to prove that you're worthy, you have to follow these certain steps. And if you're a citizen, you don't have that, and we can also talk about the idea of citizenship, where it isn't exactly the answer to what we're looking for, but I'll leave that up at a different time. And so with DACA, it creates this division of in the community, undocumented community, of who can have DACA and who cannot have DACA. And I'll pass it back on to Laura.
I know we're jumping back and forth here, so thank you for your patience with our transition. Thank you again, Norma. So, I want to be able to say that DACA was not, right, it's not a permanent solution. It obviously can be threatened by anyone, right, that comes into presidential office, and that's what we saw happen, right? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about other relevant immigration legislation that has changed or has been proposed by the Trump administration that, again, is really important for us to know because that really shapes the lived experiences of undocumented immigrants here in the United States. So we saw that he pretty much, right, Trump ran his campaign on saying that he planned to build a wall. And I remember being at several hearings while I was doing a fellowship at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where people were talking about militarizing the border, right? And those were things that have been folded out in different ways. But oftentimes we don't know that that's actually happening, right? Um, and that militarization of the border is very tactful, right? To again threaten others from coming in. And that militarization only happened at the southern border. So it's important for us to analyze, right? Who are the people that are being kept out of the United States? There was also an expanding of the definitions and previous policies to justify mass deportation. So one of the definitions that was expanded was being a criminal. And we also saw a public charge law come into effect, meaning that if you were seen as a public charge or someone who could not take care of themselves or has relied on different benefits from the United States, which most of them undocumented immigrants don't even qualify for, but the ones they do, if you had for some reason utilized certain resources, you are automatically banned from being able to apply to US residency or citizenship, which is extremely detrimental to our community. Um, we also saw an attack on sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, and they're they keep going back and forth about what the legality is behind that, right? And I know we just saw that the SCOTUS was not going to do a decision or a hearing for that. And then there was an executive order also banning refugees and immigrants from 7 Muslim majority countries at some point very early in the beginning of Trump's inauguration. But in addition to that, and I think this is something that a lot of people don't know, there actually is a current de facto asylum ban for nearly all asylum seekers seeking to enter the US through the southern border. We don't have the time to go in depth into what this means. So I really encourage people to look more into this. But a lot of people at the southern border who are fleeing are trying to, get a better life and acquire safety. A lot of them are fleeing difficult situations, are being persecuted. This significantly impacts LGBTQ communities also who are fleeing violence in their countries and persecution, and they're not being allowed into the United States seeking asylum. So this is unprecedented and something that we all need to know about. And then we also had, right, the threat to DACA. And this was huge. I think that this was on a lot of people's radars because this program has gotten a lot of attention over the years. And it was in Trump's first year that he pretty much said he wanted to rescind DACA, and that was on September 5th of 2017. And I know for me as a DACA recipient, that was completely anxiety provoking. For me, I actually thought I was already in my PhD program, which I was only able to access because of DACA. Prior to that, I didn't have a driver's license. I wasn't able to work at a university. So I wasn't able to be a TA or an RA or have access to fellowships. And once I got DACA, because I now had a social security number and a work permit, I was able to access so much more that I just didn't have access to before. But then when Trump announced that DACA was going to end, I had like a full semester where I was very tearful. I was very worried about what was going to happen to the program. And I know that that's just my story, but I have a lot of friends who have DACA and experience a lot of the similar feelings that I'm mentioning. And I remember just thinking, wow, am I not going to be able to finish my PhD program? So I just want people to put that into context because that's a lot of weight for individuals to carry for such a long time, right? We only saw the decision happen last week. And it's still a little scary, although it was a win for us, right? And I'm thankful for people like Norma who were able to use their voice to advocate for the program staying. We already saw USCIS say that they will not be following the SCOTUS decision and that they will continue to pursue in making sure that DACA ends. That is a very strong statement being sent by USCIS. And I think that's also important for us to know because although there was a little bit of relief that day, I think a lot of undocumented immigrants who had DACA are still worried about the future of this program. And so do keep that in mind and know that we still need to be having these conversations. I just talked about this, so I'm going to skip over it and I'll hand it back off to Norma again.
I just want to, sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit because I do want to highlight a few things. And I want to emphasize that in 2017, when the Trump administration decided to rescind DACA, you had this weird effect happening of work permits expiring and people not renewing, so going out of status. So many people, for these different movements that were losing their DACA status at that time. And I want to emphasize what it means to lose your work permit. So you lose your work permit, you lose your job from one day to the next. So we have people who were able to get a job, get a job in their career choice, right? And then from one day to the next, you don't have access to that anymore. And so I just want to, if you could put yourself in that situation, what would it mean for you to lose your job from one day to the next? And everything that's attached to that, right? Losing your driver's license. And those two things, that is what was happening back in 2017, slowly, right? And thankfully, with the lawsuit that I was involved in California, this was the first lawsuit that made it possible for DACA renewals to continue. So it did not allow for new applicants to apply, and it took away advanced parole, which advanced parole is very important because it allowed individuals to go out of the country for work purposes, for educational purposes, and for humanitarian reasons. So the one that is, I think, the most impactful to us with borders is the humanitarian one, because if you have a family member who is very ill, or who may have passed, advanced parole allowed you to go visit that family member. But then it was taken away, and so you couldn't do that. And so I want to emphasize, how important this is. And from there, you could just imagine the kind of anxiety, the kind of uncertainty, the kind of depressive symptoms that would come from this, and how DACA is tied to mixed status families, that you're in families that have citizenship or that don't. Maybe you have family members who weren't able to apply for DACA, but you did. So really emphasizing the complexity and like how this affects our everyday lives. Like the fear isn't just about deportation, but it's about how do you live your everyday life under these circumstances. And I'm trying to skip over to the next slide. Give me a moment. For some reason it froze. Okay. And so this emphasizes this idea that immigrants are rejected and abject subjects, where we are living in a liminal space, right, between our everyday lives in the nation and our lives as part of the nation. And it's maintained in a way to ensure control over us and social regulation. And so this is what we see when we are talking about how DACA is there as a benefit and how it's now being used against us and our own communities to promote a border wall that honestly wouldn't work. Um, and it's this lawful violence that takes place. And this part, um, this was back in 2014, so this was 2 years after DACA was instated, and I think it's interesting because we need to be aware of age groups. So when the people that had access to college or that were going to college, you were older, and even though DACA provided some help to continue with your education or maybe some opportunities, the change wasn't immediate. Even for them, the people that were older, they still lacked, opportunities because they didn't have the same kind of experience through the college experience of being able to find relevant work or relevant employment that would help them continue pursue their education. This is something that has changed throughout time when you see for people who were maybe younger getting DACA, because the earlier that you get DACA, like when you're 15, this is before you are even, finishing high school. This is like when you start. And so the ability to then get a driver's license, to get a job, to get scholarships, that really impacts your life and shapes the kind of decisions that you make. But the closer that you are to sort of aging out, to being older, the more limited opportunities that you had. And so I wanted to emphasize that difference. I don't know if Laura, you have anything to add there.
Thank you so much, Norma. And just for purposes of time, I just want to make this last point for our section here is that virtually all policies are health policies, and this includes immigration, right? So all of the immigration policies that we have are going to have some kind of impact on our families. It would be incredible if those were good, right? So something like DACA did have some positive impacts on individuals, but that also can bring up different things, right? Like Norma mentioned, the exclusion of certain individuals who couldn't apply. Families still did not have the benefits that perhaps one or two individuals in the family have, and this is going to have an impact, right? So oftentimes we see with DACA recipients that they might feel a lot of pressure because maybe they're the only ones in their family who has some kind of lawful status. And you can only imagine, right, the kind of pressure that individuals might be under because of that. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but you all do have the slides and you can download them. So know that there's some literature here that you could use. And I know that we'll talk a little bit more about this as other presenters share as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Germán right now.
Thank you, Laura and Norma, for that background. There's so much to cover here, and I wish we had more time, but I do want to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A at the end where they can ask you all, any of us, any questions. And there's a lot to cover, right, with immigration policy and And I hope that the audience is hearing that the implications for immigration policy are really complex on the health and mental health of our communities, and that as providers, it's helpful for us to learn more about immigration policy and to stay updated with what's happening and the many ways in which immigration policy constrains, right, the opportunities of our immigrant communities. And so thank you for that. So the next section is on, now that we've covered really briefly, but really in depth and in very thoroughly, the background of immigration policy and the context, sort of that policy context. Now we're going to get into the other side, which is the provider side. So understanding the impact of that context on us as mental health providers, as scholars, as teachers, as counselors, social workers. What does it look like for us? What can we do with it? And so implicit bias, many of us may be familiar with the term. It refers to biases that are discriminatory based on implicit attitudes or implicit stereotypes. Many of us may be familiar with the IAT, the implicit association test, where on a computer you take a test that kind of tells you how quickly you're responding to things that you associate should go with a particular stereotype versus another. And that's one measure of implicit association. It kind of tells us about some of those implicit, deeply rooted biases that are shaped by the society, right? That are shaped by policies, and that are shaped by what we learn in school, and in many cases are shaped by some of the history and the context that Laura and Norma were describing. These deeply racist immigration policies that are informing the way that many of us think about immigration. And we know from the literature that implicit bias against immigrants are linked to preferences related to immigration policy, to socioeconomic concerns, and intolerance towards immigrants. And so we do have some research that show that there's a link here, and maybe something that is important for us to pay attention to as providers. Okay, with this slide, I wanted to quickly summarize some of what the literature is telling us about implicit bias. And I think that many of us in the mental health profession may possibly think that because we've gotten training, and maybe because we're empathic and we have a lot of compassion and we want to help people, that we might be better off, right, when it comes to our biases. But what the research is showing is that that's not actually the case. So based on a review of experimental studies, we knew that implicit bias among mental health providers is actually different from what they actually report on surveys. We know that bias is present across levels of training, that implicit bias is reported across the board, regardless of multicultural competency, and that it doesn't vary based on level of training. So even if we have been in training for a long time, if we've been training or have been in the field for a while, these implicit biases persist. They endure. We know from the research, this is actually a study that I did myself, on teachers. We know that colorblind racial attitudes, which are a form of racism, are detrimental in preparing teachers to be able to competently teach immigrants. So we know that this is also in our schools, in our colleges, our universities. Many of you in the audience might work in these settings. So important for us to understand that these biases are informing the way that instruction is happening, pedagogy, and the way that our immigrant students are being treated, right, by teachers and professors and so on. Same thing in the healthcare field. So based on a review of 42 articles, we know that healthcare professionals exhibit the same level of bias as the general population. So, all of us who work in hospitals, who work in healthcare, are not necessarily any better, right, than the general population when it comes to these deeply rooted attitudes. And we know that healthcare providers across levels of training and across disciplines exhibit pro-white or light-skin bias and anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Indigenous, anti-dark skin bias. And this is pretty concerning, right? This is based on 37 reviews, 37 studies. So something to keep in mind, right? That as we try to work with immigrant communities as providers, these biases will come into play somehow, and perhaps we can get ahead of it by trying to address some of these biases so that they don't cause further harm with our immigrant clients. When I think about this, I think about when I was actually undocumented and a graduate student. I was helping a professor collect data at a middle school in a Southwest state where they had recently passed a law that allowed the police to be able to ask people for immigration papers, SB 1070, and basically gave police the power to racially profile individuals to essentially serve as immigration agents. And I was at the school, I was collecting data, and in between the break, I was talking with a teacher who was also of Latinx background, like me, also identified as a Latinx person. And the teacher told me, after the break, you're going to see the children come in, and by this grade, we know which of them are going to end up in prison. And you will see that all of the students that are sitting on this side of the classroom are the kids who are causing trouble at school, and we know that they're going to end up in prison. And when the children came in after break, it was all of the children who were Black, who were Latinx, and particularly the dark-skinned Latinx children. And so an example to show you what implicit bias looks like in practice, right? What a teacher who holds implicit biases, how this might be informing the way that they perceive the students and the way that they're working with the students in the classroom, and in some way even making decisions about the future of the students and where they belong. They belong in prison? Do they belong in college? Do they belong somewhere else? And so this is deeply troubling, right? So something for us to address. I've had many students tell me that professors at college campuses at multiple universities often use the I word, the word illegal, which we try to refrain from using because we believe that no human being is illegal, right? And when professors use these kinds of language, and this is really harmful, right? This is really upsetting for immigrant students. I had a student tell me that once a TA for a class that they were taking on a college campus on Halloween came dressed up as a political figure who is notable for being an anti-immigration figure. And seeing their TA dressed up like this in the classroom on Halloween was deeply upsetting, deeply anxiety provoking for the student, right? And again, just an example for what our implicit biases can look like in practice, and how offensive they can be to immigrant communities and how harmful, deeply harmful. So we know that implicit biases are dangerous, right? They may influence policies, but where do they come from? So I wanted to go back to the root to examine some of the possible origins, right, of some of the implicit biases that we currently have, and some of them come from sort of the legacy of colonization in this continent, and the dark and harmful legacy of slavery and the taking of lands from the indigenous people. And so if we look on the left-hand side, if we look at that pyramid, it's a visualization of a caste system, a castas system that colonizers brought to the Americas, where they essentially imposed racial hierarchies that always favored white Europeans. They were always considered more evolved than everybody else, with African and indigenous peoples being at the bottom, being considered less evolved, being considered less human, right? And this is the type of thinking that that justified a lot of awful policies, right? And practices like slavery, like taking the land of indigenous people, and it justified the very first Immigration Act from 1790, which created the concept of citizenship. And the concept of citizenship was actually only available to free white persons that behaved like a man of good moral character. So we can see from that description that that this was a really racist, really sexist policy, and it sort of became the foundation of the current immigration system, because everything that came afterward was a deviation from that, right? Was a product of that. And so we can see how very intentionally the immigration system was put in place to create a system of white supremacy that excluded immigrants who were African, who were from Asian countries, and excluded people who were already here, the indigenous people that were already here. And we're still working through the system, right? Like Laura and Norma said in their review. It's a deeply racist system. And we know that social Darwinism, eugenics, scientific racism were actually used as frameworks to craft legislation, immigration policies during the 19th and 20th century. And if we look at the history of immigration in more depth, we can see that throughout time, immigration policy has always been more aggressive and more violent towards communities of color. So going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment camps, the quote-unquote wetback program, unfortunately, the history has been quite aggressive towards Black and brown immigrants. So what does implicit bias look like now? In this slide, we have a long list of common myths about immigrants. I won't have time to read over each of them or to provide a counter to each of them, but we do have facts that show that these myths are completely false. But these are myths that are out there in the media, right? They're in the popular culture, they're part of the narrative about immigration. And we know that these myths are extremely harmful, right? Because they shape opinions and they shape practice and they shape what we think about immigrants in a very, very insidious way. For example, Laura was mentioning that after DACA, after the huge victory of DACA last week, USCIS came up with a statement saying that they were going to continue fighting to take DACA away. In their public statement, USCIS said that undocumented immigrants are here taking American jobs, which is a myth. We have extensive research from economics, from different fields that actually show that immigrants create jobs and contribute billions of dollars to the economy. And so just to give us an example of how these implicit biases are harmful, and especially so when they're used by people in power, right? When they're used by the government or even by providers, right? Or teachers who are in a position of power to alter somebody's trajectory in many ways, or in the way that we provide support. So these are some sources of factual information about immigration. I will leave them there. This is not an extensive list, but simply a place to start to maybe learn more about the myths, and also learn more about the facts and the actual numbers and the research showing what immigration is actually like, and how it might be different from what we may hear from other people, and what we may hear from some of the media outlets out there. But I want to end on a hopeful note for providers. So what do we do with all of this information as therapists? As a starting point, we can begin by self-reflecting, by asking ourselves, what do I actually know about immigration? What are the facts that I know? Maybe listing some of the things that come up, creating a list, and then doing a quick search to see if what I think I know is actually true, if it actually holds up. What perceptions and beliefs do I have about immigrants, and where do these come from? What systems, what family, friends, co-workers, who has informed these views about immigration, and how can I challenge them? How did I develop these perceptions? What emotions come up as I think about these perceptions towards immigrants? Do I feel any anger? Do I feel any fear, any anxiety, any sadness, guilt? And working through those emotions as a provider could be really helpful in getting us to a better place to be able to work with immigrants competently. And then the last thing I'll say, and this actually comes from some of my own research, is that we have some evidence that having contact with undocumented immigrants, having been able to talk with them, having exposure to their real life narratives, combined with learning facts and policies about immigration, have actually been linked to increasing positive attitudes towards immigrants. Having this contact, listening to the narratives, learning about the facts is actually linked to lower anxiety about immigrants, higher empathy about immigrants, and overall having less prejudice. So even though these attitudes are persistent and they endure and they have endured for hundreds of years, there's something that as providers, there's something that we can do to address them and to improve them so that we can provide competent services. So with that, I'll pass it over to Alfonso.
All right. Thank you, Germán, on your discussion and exploration on implicit bias and ways to challenge that as psychologists, right? I do want to add the impact of COVID-19 on the different immigrant communities here in the United States. And, I am working with a couple different task force from many different associations, and we've been working, very hard together as a team to disseminate some of what I'm going to share today. But, as we know, currently the pandemic has, significantly affected millions, causing disproportionate health and economic effects, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And one thing to highlight also is that it's uncovering significant disparities already in existence here in the United States, right? But specific to COVID-19, there are significant disparities by race, ethnicity, with particularly poor outcomes for Latinx and the African American community. I know Laura right now is writing a piece on covering some of the factors contributing to this disparity in health and currently in this pandemic. So Laura, if you want to go ahead and maybe share with us some of what you're finding.
Yes, thank you so much, Alfonso. And I think, we saw that the CDC came out with information saying that 33% of Hispanic, 22% Black, and 1.3 were American Indian who have been impacted by COVID. And this suggests that persons in these groups are disproportionately impacted when you compare that to the overall US population. And so that's really important to mention, right? But we know that years, decades really, of segregation and discriminatory housing policies, poor environmental protections, and other forms of government sanctioned discrimination and systemic racism, such as all the things that we've been sharing with you on our webinar today, really are the things that contribute to immigrants and other persons of color being vulnerable to COVID, right? So it's really important to distinguish that it's not because an individual is Latinx, right, or Black. It's because of the system and all the disparities that an individual is subjected to, right, that it makes them highly vulnerable and susceptible to this pandemic, right? And so I think that's really important to note. And it has a lot of implications for us as well, right? And it's important to recognize that as we work with individuals, and to be careful not to blame individuals as well, right? Because I have seen that happen in medical settings, unfortunately.
Very good, Laura. Thank you so much for uncovering reasons and contributing factors that we're seeing across people of color in regards to COVID-19 and disparities that have occurred for such a long time in our country. Another thing that COVID-19 has brought is the presenting many reasons to portray stigmatize undocumented immigrant groups and asylum seekers as well as agents of disease and as a public health hazard to the United States. So the current administration has cited that in many policies and many timely documents, and really have highlighted that to affect the current immigration system here in the United States. For example, there's been a surge of deportations. In addition, we're looking at orders that were disseminated back on March 20th, for example. The administration disseminated a rule and accompanying government order to immediately turn back asylum seekers without affording them a legal process, citing rapid transmission of COVID-19. Living and working down here in South Texas in this border community, and doing research with the immigrant groups and asylum seekers and the families on the border. The border was quickly closed at that time that I mentioned, and this closure of the U.S.-Mexico border really suspended all the court hearings for asylum seekers awaiting those hearings. The remain in Mexico policy, for example, took effect a year prior, back in March 19. So this has resulted, not only sending tens and thousands of people seeking refuge to the border towns of Mexico and the United States on the Mexico side. And my lab student and myself, along with community leaders in South Texas, we visited these tent encampments in Matamoros, Mexico, for example, which is south of Brownsville. And that specific tent encampment has over 2,500 families. These are children, these are mothers, these are fathers who have had a court hearing for their asylum seeking right, and it's been closed, it's been shut down. One big concern is that they're living in unsanitary conditions. They're living in tents in the enclosed area along the Rio Grande River. And unfortunately, only nonprofit organizations, international organizations like Global Aid, have been on the front lines assisting with preventative measures of COVID-19, because once it's it reaches the tent encampment, it's going to spread like wildfire, and it's a crisis. And many of these families are being exposed to that, and unfortunately, these hearings have been canceled. And they've been living there for quite some time. I know families that their hearings are not till June 2021, and living in those areas is very concerning, especially with the growing violence in Mexico that they are exposed to. So that's another group. And then another group, obviously, the detention centers, where we're seeing concerns of, CDC guidelines of COVID-19 not being implemented. Really, it's hard to implement CDC guidelines in detention centers, where the families are awaiting, their fate, their future. Another area that is very important to highlight is that this global pandemic has exposed the irony inherent in these negative attitudes that I mentioned. For example, over 27,000 DACA recipients are in the front lines in the healthcare profession, supporting the occupations of responding to COVID-19, right? And these are individuals, close to 800,000 individuals that are, DACA recipients that are living in our community. They are working, they are professionals. Thank you, Laura and Norma, for sharing your stories. You guys are future psychologists. You're going to give so much to our communities, our clients, and wherever your profession takes you. And it's important to know that they've had an opportunity to work. I know fellow DACA colleagues that are lawyers, doctors, and in medical school, and those are just some examples. But having a program that is pending and that is in limbo, during a pandemic, are multiple crises that these individuals, these different groups are experiencing. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example. So many things are going on currently in our society, and globally that are multiple ingredients working together to cause significant health concerns. Another group that that I my students and I recently did a short article on the invisible essential workers of COVID-19. These are the different immigrants that are essential. They have always been essential to run our country, right? But they're not getting the much media attention that the other medical essential workers, and they're doing an amazing job to fight our pandemic here in our country. But these are the hospital cleaning staff. These are the farm workers, picking our vegetables and working in all of these different settings in order for us to have food in our table, on our table during quarantine when we are unable to leave our home. So despite the invaluable service they are providing and the sacrifices they're making, these undocumented immigrant groups are excluded from benefits like the CARES Act that many of us are recipients of. So that's another example of the stressors that also exist. So as I mentioned before, amid a global pandemic and the recent events, have exacerbated and intensified fear among DACA recipients. And April 21, there was a report from an internal investigation revealing that ICE now have access to DACA recipients personal information. So that's another factor to consider and to talk about. So all these shocking revelations during the current pandemic are different examples of how anti-immigration action that bestows unprecedented levels of fear to already vulnerable communities. My colleague, Dr. Luz Garcini, did a really timely study that highlighted the different risk factors and the health outcomes, that many of the immigrant communities, encounter, when, especially during a global pandemic, you know, she said it very, very, when she described what, many immigrants and undocumented individuals, live, that day, that daily, that daily fear, that daily stress of government official encounters, whether it's police officers or ICE officers, that daily stress that they experience really resembles and mimics what we are all experiencing right now during a global pandemic. That fear of being exposed to the virus, that fear of being another, statistic, right? The fear of dying. Many individuals are dying due to COVID-19, right? So that anxiety that globally, and the mental health symptoms that we are all experiencing, given the concerns of COVID-19 and having no cure, no vaccination, those behaviors and those feelings and those symptoms that we are experiencing, that is those are symptoms and behaviors that DACA recipients and undocumented individuals have experienced for most of their lives, right? So we're getting a little glimpse, not completely, but just a little taste of of living in constant fear during a global pandemic. These are additional chronic stressors that you see here on the screen among undocumented immigrants and their families. I don't want to read them. I know Laura shared one story, her story on, the anxiety and that constant fear that she lives. And Laura, if you want to add, add to this section here as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alfonso. I think somebody asked a question about, right, like the good immigrant. And I think that's so important to bring into this, right? Because all of these policies really make individuals, want to like behave, right, and be like this perfect person. But pretty much these policies kind of shape us into like not being human, right? So we can't make any human mistakes. And I share this example where I was actually pulled over by university police for speeding, and I think that's a pretty normal human experience here in the U.S. Not excusing my behavior, but the implications that one ticket had for me were dire. And I had the police officer um, pulled me over and first wrote out the ticket to the wrong person, so expected me to correct him. And then he had to leave on an emergency and said he was going to mail me my ticket. And I was like, okay, he's going to mail me my ticket. He literally pulled me over in my driveway. So I was like close to my apartment building. And I went home. I was close to midnight. So I got into my PJs, and all of a sudden I hear a knock at my door. And I was like, who the heck is knocking at my door? And I was already like, pretty freaked out by the interaction that had occurred. And he's just standing at my door. I open the door and it's the police officer. And he's just standing there. He's just staring me up and down, and he's not saying anything to me. So that felt pretty scary to me, and aggressive. And it definitely felt like he was abusing his power. Like, why is he showing up at my house after midnight when he said he was going to mail me my ticket? So that was like one part of the experience. Because of all the implications that that had, I never got to report that incident and how unsafe I felt in that moment. Um, he ended up giving me my ticket and leaving, but only after I was like, what are you doing here? Because he was just standing at my door and had nothing to say. Um, and then, the next day, I had to figure out, how is this going to implicate my DACA? Because for my ticket, he gave me such a high ticket. So saying that my driver's license, sorry, was going to be suspended because of this one citation, because the points were so high on that citation. Which, if you think about it again, I'm pulling into my driveway, so it makes no sense that I would be speeding as high as he said I was speeding, right? But for me, the next day, I couldn't even see clients because I was in so much distress about how this could potentially prevent me from reapplying to DACA. And I had to hire an attorney, figure out how to get money. There was no pro bono legal services that I had access to, and I just had to get this taken care of really quickly. The irony of this was that I had just trained police officers on how to sensitively work with undocumented immigrant and Latinx communities. And yet here I was in the situation, right? And the part that I mean about the good, immigrant mentalities, it doesn't matter if you get pulled over as an undocumented immigrant. It doesn't matter what degrees you have. It doesn't matter what your profession is. It doesn't matter what status you have. That can literally become an instance that changes your life. And that's how I felt. I felt like if this doesn't get taken care of, I could potentially get deported. So it doesn't matter how good I am, right? And so that's really important for us to highlight, because sometimes people think, well, if you're just good and stay out of trouble, things are okay. People get deported just by having a tail light out on your car. So that just highlights, right, the level of fear and precaution that people have to live with on a day in, day out basis. So essentially, sometimes it feels like you can't be human and make human errors.
Wow, thank you, Laura, for sharing your story. And as academicians and scientists and psychologists, we read this, in the studies, and we review this in workbooks, but hearing stories that support what science is letting us know, is so important, especially as psychologists working, with this population. Here's another timely, work and another project that colleagues of mine have recently completed. For example, Luce did an amazing job in Houston back in 2017 when DACA was initially rescinded, and that specific data, the data that was collected. This was during Hurricane Harvey, another natural disaster, and the announcement of the rescission of DACA. Right, so we're dealing with two crises and the compound effects. Right, so what the data really highlighted was that over 40% of the participants in the study showed trauma-related symptoms indicative of post-traumatic stress disorder. Right, so these symptoms are real, and that's something that we as psychologists and mental health professionals, need to understand. And findings are consistent as well with previous research that has been done. Highlighting the high risks for psychological distress due to trauma and discrimination related to the anti-immigrant sentiment that we're currently experiencing. And something that I've already highlighted and stressed, I know we only have few minutes left, is that when we're dealing with multiple crises at the same time, the health risks, right, diminishes in addition to social outcomes. So that the different ingredients that we're seeing can seriously compromise the physical and mental health, as well as social networks. And lastly, what do we do? What do we do as psychologists, as mental health professionals? It's very important to not only provide clinical work as psychologists that we're doing, but many of us in the field are doing research. Right? Let's highlight the science behind this. Right? Let's get together with our professional associations. And all helping professions have an ethical duty, right, to help people in times of need. And they are charged with ensuring their basic human rights, regardless of class, gender, political affiliation, or legal status. So what do we do as psychologists? Advocacy, is crucial. Webinars like this, for example, this was a partnership. I'm so excited that APA and NLPA and the different groups that were mentioned earlier today are working together, mobilizing efforts to address this national crisis amid a global pandemic. Recently, I'm part of the executive committee of the Texas Psychological Association, and we were in the midst of generating a statement for Black Lives Matter. And the group, the group decided to, let's not just do a statement. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? Many of us are currently experiencing statement fatigue. It's real, but let's take it further and have action items. So we developed a racial justice task force at TPA, and we have goals, on addressing the racial injustice in psychology, both to highlight, the clinical work, working with people of color in addition to research and academic contexts. One organization that we partnered up with is the United We Dream up in DC, who are the largest advocating organization for DACA recipients. It started back in 2017. We worked with them. We're generating a mental health directory, seeing what mental health providers can provide pro bono work. So we're working on that. We're revisiting that. In addition to the, providing clinical tools for psychologists and mental health professionals, and what Germán and his team did and what he talked about earlier, and that's going to be highlighted during these series. So I do want to end here. Germán, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Alfonso. So we do have a few minutes for a Q&A, and I think the moderator for the webinar is going to help us bring up some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to reiterate, if you have any questions you'd like to be asked, please type it in the Q&A section on the right side of your screen. First question. It was my understanding that speeding tickets could cause problems for DACA status. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think I just spoke to that a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time there. But not just any ticket. I think there's more threat when your license is suspended. So sometimes it's not said why your license is suspended, but people who have gotten a speeding ticket can apply for DACA. So I want to make that clear. So folks, since right now DACA is open, I want to make it clear that if you have a speeding ticket on your record, you can apply for DACA. But I also want to caution this advice and say that it's always important to seek legal representation and ask these questions to someone that is knowledgeable in the law, because people might have unique circumstances as to why that could become a threat. So for me, the ticket I was given was so high that it was going to make my license not lawful anymore. So it was going to become suspended. And when you pull up a record, it doesn't say if your license is suspended because you got a DUI or because of reckless driving or because you have a seizure disorder. It just says your license is suspended. So immigration officials could look at that and automatically disqualify you. So I just want to leave it there, but always seek legal advice when it comes to these questions.
And if I can add something to that, Laura, I'm glad that you highlighted that it's best to seek legal advice, right? And to work with somebody on your case because every case is different. Informed Immigrant has a tool for finding legal support based on your zip code, and a lot of it is pro bono support or sliding scale. So it's informedimmigrant.com. It's also in Spanish, and people can find legal support in their area that is completely pro bono.
Given how DACA is exclusionary and based on the good immigrant fallacy, how does this play out in families where some siblings qualified and others didn't? What's the impact on family dynamics and on mental health treatment?
So I could enter a little bit, and then if anybody else has something to add. I think when it comes to the different like mixed status families, like it could be there's a lot of variables to consider. So I know at times if you're a DACA recipient and a family member doesn't have any kind of protection, there could be a lot of guilt, a lot of shame involved in terms of why do I have this, but my brother or my mom doesn't have it, and it can impact how we access resources. So maybe someone is more hesitant to renew DACA, or they're more hesitant to maybe get a driver's license. And so all of this combines in terms of what your life actually looks like day to day. So I think that's one place to start, but um, it's a very broad experience.
Could someone please comment on why citizenship is not a good option?
Maybe I can jump in unless anybody else. Yeah. Well, I think it's good to highlight that citizenship would be an excellent option for 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, if they had access to the pathway to get there. The reason why we have 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country is because the laws are outdated and they don't provide a pathway for people who come here, who are fleeing very difficult conditions in our home countries. I think many of us talked about that, and who are here um, seeking a better life. There's really no pathway for them to enter the quote unquote line to be able to get citizenship. Um, and this is why we need to update our policies and update our immigration system so that those 11 million people have a fair chance to enter a pathway to citizenship. Um, so it's not that citizenship is not a good option, it's that it simply isn't an option at all for people to access it.
And I think if I could jump in, I think that question was in related to something I said about citizenship not being the end goal. And so while yes, we want citizenship, we also want to recognize the way that actually in your presentation you talk about how citizenship was created specifically for white males, and so how it's tied to whiteness and white supremacy. And when we make citizenship our end goal, um, and don't challenge this rhetoric, that's where we keep propelling the same kind of exclusionary policies and making the same kind of problems that we are trying to mend.
Can you please elaborate on how colorblindness can be detrimental, and can you give examples?
Yes, absolutely. And to kind of build on what Norma was saying, I think that what we want to highlight is that everybody's humanities and worth is what that should be our end goal, right? That everybody should be treated fairly and equally, and they should be protected by the law regardless of citizenship, because citizenship has been reserved for privileged groups historically, right? And so in many ways, the dignity, right, of our immigrant communities is our goal. Um, not just getting citizenship, but citizenship is certainly something that we hope will be available one day, right? Um, color blindness. So a colorblind attitude is basically saying I don't see color, right? I see people, I don't see color, and like I don't see black, white, and some people think that this is a positive thing, right? To have those kinds of beliefs, and they may mean well, but in saying that you don't see color, we are actually denying the uniqueness of our experiences based on race and ethnicity. And we are minimizing that race and ethnicity are really powerful societal forces that shape everything, right? Including access to the immigration system, like we've been saying all along. And so the idea is to recognize that there are differences based on race and ethnicity, and that we need to tackle some of those inequities to create a more fair, more equitable system where everybody can prosper. Alfonso, I see you have something.
Yeah, color blindness, it is a micro invalidation, and it's actually a type of microaggression. This is something that Dr. Su, has highlighted in many of his work, right? So, when people say that, it's very important to, process that and consult, especially as clinicians, because that really invalidates the struggle that people of color have experienced. We need to check ourselves, as psychologists and clinicians working with this population. So, consultation, would be strongly encouraged.
Thank you very much for the insight. That's all the time we have for today's webinar. On behalf of the APA, we would like to thank our presenters for today's presentation. Of course, we would also like to thank you for tuning into today's program. Please join us for the second installment of the series, Developing Psychotherapy Strategies to Foster Resilience and Prevent Trauma Among Immigrant Communities on July 10th at 1 p.m. ET. Registration opens July 2nd. Remember, to receive continuing education credit, please complete the evaluation. You'll receive your documentation of CE credits soon after. This concludes today's presentation.